The night was colder than usual, an early winter frost crawling across the small rural town like an omen. Blue and red police lights flashed rhythmically against the old brick houses, illuminating the narrow street where neighbors gathered in silence, wrapped in blankets and fear. Inside the modest two-story home, officers moved quietly, their boots crunching on fragments of shattered glass still scattered across the wooden floor. A young woman, just 26 years old, lay lifeless in her bedroom. No signs of forced entry. No fingerprints. No struggle. Just a chilling, eerie stillness that clung to the air like heavy smoke. Detective Aaron Hale, the first senior officer to arrive, paused near the doorway. He had been on dozens of death scenes, but the atmosphere in this house felt different, heavier, almost watchful. Something here didn't make sense, and everyone in the room could feel it. The paramedics exchanged uncomfortable glances. The junior officers avoided eye contact. Even the forensics team worked slower than usual, as if scared of disturbing something invisible. Then, under his breath, one officer muttered the words that would set the tone for the rest of the investigation: "Not again." "It's that family." Detective Hale's head snapped toward him. "What do you mean?" he demanded. But the young officer didn't answer. Instead, he simply gestured toward the framed photos on the wall. For generations of family portraits hung side by side, faces smiling warmly at the camera, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Beneath each photo was a neatly written name, and the same tragic pattern. Each generation had lost someone young, healthy, and full of life under nearly identical circumstances. The newest victim, Elara Winton, was the fourth in line. A grandmother in the crowd outside whispered to her neighbor, trembling, "They said it again. The word, curse." And this time, for the first time, the police didn't dismiss it. Inside the home, Hale crouched beside the body, examining the lifeless expression on Elara's face. No bruises. No defensive wounds. No signs of poisoning, at least not immediately visible. On the bedside table, a single object caught his eye, an antique silver pendant. Delicate, ornate, and strangely out of place in a room filled with modern furniture. He reached for it, hesitating when a cold shiver ran up his arm before he even touched it. "Don't," a voice said behind him. One of the senior officers, a man with 20 years on the force, stared at the pendant with an expression Hale had never seen on him: fear. "It belonged to her great-grandfather," the officer said quietly. "Every one of them had it with them when they died." It wasn't an official statement. More like a confession, one spoken by someone who had seen far too much. Hale frowned. "You think this is connected?" The officer swallowed. "Look, I don't believe in curses. But this family, every generation, one dies the same way. No marks. No cause. Just, gone." The detective didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the room. Although everything seemed physically untouched, the air itself felt disturbed, like a presence lingered just beyond understanding. Elara's final moments were silent, calm, too calm. Whatever happened had left no trace. Or perhaps it had left a trace only those who knew the family's history could recognize. A neighbor, interviewed outside, added fuel to the growing mystery. "Elara told me she felt something was coming. She said it always happens around her birthday. The same thing that happened to her father, and his father before him." The pattern was undeniable. The coincidences were impossible. And the fear was spreading quickly. Hale walked back into the house, glancing once more at the family portraits lining the wall. A chill crept down his spine as he noticed something that hadn't registered before. In each portrait, every victim wore the same pendant he had seen on Elara's bedside table. Generations divided by decades, yet the same object remained. He leaned closer, studying the oldest portrait. The first victim, Elara's great-grandfather, smiled proudly, unaware that his tragic death would echo through time. Hale whispered to himself, "There has to be a reason behind all of this." But as he turned, he caught the uneasy stare of the young officer from earlier. "If you saw their history," the officer murmured, voice barely above a whisper, "you'd think it was a curse too." And with that, the seeds of the documentary's central question took root: is this a case of dark superstition woven through generations, or is something very real, and very human, behind these deaths? The investigation was only beginning, yet already the boundaries between crime, history, and superstition were blurring. The fourth death wasn't just another tragedy. It was a warning. A chilling legacy was unraveling. And the truth was far darker than anyone dared imagine. The story of the so-called family curse begins long before modern investigators ever stepped into the picture. It begins nearly a century ago, in a time when tragedy was often dismissed as fate, and the whispers of rural towns carried more superstition than science. The first recorded death in the Winton bloodline belonged to a man named Rowan Winton, a gentle, hard-working father of two, known in his community for his loyalty and quiet resilience. He was not wealthy, not powerful, and not someone who attracted enemies. In every sense, he lived a simple, modest life, one that should have kept him far from mystery. Yet it was Rowan whose death would plant the first seed of a story that refused to die. Rowan was only 31 when he was found lifeless in his workshop. His tools lay neatly in place, wood shavings scattered across the table as if he had simply paused mid-task. But his body showed no signs of injury, and the room carried no indication of a struggle. There was no broken furniture, no sign of forced entry, no scent of chemicals or gas. One moment he had been alive, shaping a wooden cradle for his newborn son. The next, he was gone. His wife, Lillian, discovered him after hearing a strange thud, a sound she later described as, too soft to belong to death, but too heavy to belong to life. The doctor, limited by the medical knowledge of the era, hesitated before listing the cause of death as heart failure, though the truth was he had no explanation. Rowan's health had been strong. No prior illnesses, no complaints, no warning signs. His sudden passing puzzled everyone who knew him. But at the time, people shook their heads, offered sympathetic glances, and chalked it up to life's cruel unpredictability. There was grief, yes, but no suspicion, no theory, no shadow yet lurking over the family name. Yet even then, something about Rowan's death felt strangely incomplete. In his hand, when his wife found him, he clutched a small silver pendant, an old family heirloom passed down through generations. Lillian claimed she had never seen Rowan wear it before, and he certainly hadn't been holding it earlier that morning. She remembered placing it in their bedroom drawer days earlier, tucked safely beneath folded clothes. Why it ended up in his hand remained a question she never received an answer to. Neighbors murmured that perhaps Rowan had been sentimental, thinking of his ancestors while crafting a crib for the future. It was a soothing explanation, but not necessarily a true one. Life moved on, as it always does after tragedy. Lillian raised their two children alone, doing her best to shield them from the weight of loss. Rowan's death became a sad memory, whispered occasionally but never investigated beyond the initial report. The community believed the tragedy began and ended with one man. But in hindsight, Rowan's death was not an ending, it was the quiet beginning of a much darker narrative. As years passed, Rowan's children grew. The family seemed to recover, their lives slowly drifting toward normalcy. But within the Winton household, subtle unease lingered. Lillian often spoke of feeling watched at night, of hearing footsteps outside her bedroom door when she knew her children were asleep. She dismissed these moments as exhaustion or grief, but in her diary, found decades later, she confessed to a chilling fear. She believed something had come into their home the night Rowan died, and she feared it hadn't left. What truly deepened the mystery, however, was what happened to the pendant. After Rowan's funeral, Lillian tried to put the heirloom away, but she swore it would not stay in the drawer. Time and time again, she would find it on Rowan's old workbench, or beside his favorite chair, or resting quietly beneath a pillow. Each time she tried to return it to the drawer, it somehow reappeared elsewhere, always without explanation. Eventually, exhausted by grief and fear, she locked it inside a small wooden box. And there it remained, undisturbed, for years. At least, that's what she believed. The true significance of the pendant would not become clear until the next generation faced its own tragedy. But even now, looking back on Rowan's death, investigators would later note how many overlooked signs pointed toward a disturbing pattern. The unexplained presence of the pendant. The absence of physical trauma. The eerily peaceful state of Rowan's body. The strange sounds Lillian heard that night, sounds she could never fully describe. For the town, Rowan's death was a sad but isolated event. For the Winton family, it was the first shadow cast over a lineage that would suffer more loss than any one bloodline should bear. It was the tragedy that should have ended there, the tragedy that should have been enough. And yet, it wasn't. Because years later, when Rowan's son died under the same baffling circumstances, people would look back at Rowan's death with new eyes. What once seemed like misfortune began to feel like the opening chapter of something haunting, calculated, and impossibly connected. The first tragedy was no longer a standalone sorrow. It was the beginning of a cycle. A cycle waiting for its next victim. And as future investigators pieced together the family history, they would realize something chilling. If Rowan's death had been understood for what it truly was, the curse might have been stopped before it ever continued. The section ends here, with unanswered questions forming the backbone of what's to come, because the next death would make the whispers grow louder, and the pattern impossible to ignore. For almost 2 decades after Rowan Winton's unexplained passing, the family managed to live in the fragile balance between grief and normalcy. His son, Adrian Winton, had grown into a quiet, thoughtful young man, someone who carried echoes of his father's gentle nature but also the unspoken burden of a childhood scarred by loss. Those who knew him described him as kind, introspective, and strangely distant at times, as though part of him lived in a world that the rest could not see. Yet no one suspected that Adrian's life would end in a way that mirrored his father's with haunting precision. By the time Adrian turned 28, he had established himself as a respected carpenter, carrying on his father's trade almost instinctively, despite barely remembering the man who taught him. His workshop stood on the same patch of land Rowan had once used, rebuilt and modernized but still infused with the history of the family. Locals admired Adrian's dedication, noting how his hands seemed to move with the same practiced motion Rowan's once had. It was as if the past lived through him. Perhaps, in ways no one recognized at the time, it truly did. The day Adrian died began like any other. The morning sun was soft, the air crisp, and Adrian was seen smiling as he purchased lumber from a nearby vendor. Witnesses later recalled how healthy he appeared, strong, energetic, even optimistic about a new project he had just begun. Nothing about his demeanor hinted at danger. No shadow lingered behind him, no fear flickered in his eyes. If anything, he looked like a man stepping into a promising chapter of life. But fate, or something masquerading as fate, had other plans. That evening, when Adrian did not return home, neighbors assumed he was working late. The warm glow of his workshop lights flickered through the windows as dusk settled over the town. Only when those lights abruptly went out did concern begin to stir. His mother, Lillian, now older and more fragile, felt a familiar dread tightening in her chest. She approached the workshop slowly, calling his name. As she pushed the door open, a cold stillness greeted her. Adrian lay on the floor beside his workbench, positioned almost exactly as his father had been found decades earlier. His hands were still, his eyes partially open, showing no fear or pain, only a lifeless calm. Beside him, on the bench, rested the same silver pendant Rowan had clutched the night he died. And just like before, there were no signs of struggle, no wounds, no explanation. Lillian screamed. Not because she didn't understand what she saw, but because she understood it far too well. She had lived this nightmare before. The moment her eyes landed on the pendant, the breath left her body. Her mind went back to the warnings she had written in her diary, the footsteps she heard in the empty hallway, the pendant that never stayed where she placed it. The fear she had tried to bury resurfaced all at once. The doctor who examined Adrian arrived at a disturbingly similar conclusion: healthy heart, no illness, no trauma, no detectable poison. His death, like Rowan's, was labeled unexplained. But this time, the community did not accept the explanation so easily. People whispered in markets, at church gatherings, and behind closed doors. Some claimed bad luck had struck the family again. Others began speaking openly of something darker, something inherited, something that stalked the bloodline waiting for the right moment. The most unsettling detail, which investigators documented with hesitation, was the condition of the workshop. Nothing was out of place. No unfinished tool lay scattered on the floor, no broken materials indicated a sudden accident. Instead, the workshop felt eerily staged, preserved, and undisturbed, as though death had entered the room without touching a single thing. When police questioned Lillian, she confessed something she had never told anyone before: the pendant had been locked away for years. She kept the key hidden, ensuring no one could open the box where it rested. And yet somehow, without breaking the lock or disturbing the lid, the pendant was found beside her dead son. The moment she said those words, the room fell silent. Even the lead investigator, typically rational and composed, felt a chill settle in the air. For Adrian's sister, young Mara, his death was both devastating and eerily familiar. She remembered seeing the pendant in the workshop days earlier but assumed Adrian had found it and brought it out himself. Now, that memory gnawed at her. Had he been drawn to it? Had someone placed it there? Or had it appeared on its own, as her mother feared? Rumors swirled through the town like wildfire. Some speculated the family was cursed, destined to lose a child every generation. Others believed someone held a grudge so deep that it stretched across decades. But the most frightening theory came from an old neighbor who remembered Rowan clearly. She recalled hearing the same strange thud the night Rowan died. She claimed to have heard it again on the night Adrian passed, a sound too faint to be a fall, yet too deliberate to be dismissed. Adrian's funeral mirrored Rowan's in tone, quiet, sorrowful, heavy with unspoken fear. But unlike Rowan's death, Adrian's tragedy left behind a creeping sense of inevitability. This was not coincidence. This was not random misfortune. Something was wrong, and everyone felt it. The investigators, compiling their reports years later, noted a disturbing line in one officer's private notes: "If this happens again, we're looking at a pattern, not chance." This sentence would later become the turning point in understanding the Winton family history. Because Adrian's death didn't just repeat the past, it set the stage for a chilling realization: what killed Rowan had now taken Adrian. And if the pattern continued, the curse, or whatever force orchestrated these deaths, had no intention of stopping. For years after Adrian's death, the Winton family lived under a shadow that never truly lifted. Though they tried to rebuild their lives, the memory of two identical tragedies lingered in every corner of their home. Mara Winton, Rowan's granddaughter and Adrian's sister, grew up with a kind of vigilance that no child should ever possess. She learned early that silence carried weight, and that certain questions were never asked aloud. Her mother, Lillian, protected her fiercely, yet the fear in her eyes only deepened as Mara approached adulthood. By the time Mara turned 30, she had built a quiet life as a schoolteacher, far away from the old workshop and the echoes of her father and grandfather's deaths. She believed distance would save her. She believed leaving behind the town, the superstition, and the legacy would allow her to start fresh. But curses, real or imagined, do not respect geography. They cling to bloodlines, not properties. Mara's son, Daniel, became the third generation caught in the shadow of an unexplainable fate. Daniel was brilliant. A promising university student pursuing mechanical engineering, known for his sharp mind and unwavering discipline. There was something undeniably bright about him, something hopeful, something that made even strangers root for his success. But those close to him noticed subtle changes during his final semester. He seemed distracted, sometimes pausing mid-sentence as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. He spoke once, cryptically, about dreams that felt too vivid, about hearing footsteps outside his apartment that vanished when he turned on the lights. His friends assumed stress. His mother feared déjà vu. Daniel died on a rainy Tuesday in early autumn. His professor found him in a study lab late at night, slumped peacefully over his notebook, pen still in hand. No chaos, no signs of distress. Just a motionless body in the same unnatural serenity that claimed Rowan and Adrian before him. The silver pendant, locked away by Lillian years ago, untouched since Adrian's funeral, was found dangling from Daniel's hand. When Mara received the call, she collapsed before she even processed the words. It wasn't shock that destroyed her, it was recognition. The pattern had arrived at her doorstep again. The curse had not forgotten her family. It had simply waited patiently for its next victim. This time, however, the news spread far beyond the town's borders. 3 identical unexplained deaths in the same bloodline caught the attention of academics, statisticians, and journalists searching for a story that defied probability. One statistician, Dr. Evelyn Marsh, became particularly fascinated. Her research focused on rare patterns in human mortality, and the Winton case didn't just raise questions, it overturned existing mathematical expectations. Standing before a board of her peers, Dr. Marsh presented the chilling conclusion that would make national headlines: the probability of 3 unrelated, medically unexplained deaths occurring in the same family, under nearly identical conditions, is not just low, it is functionally impossible. She emphasized that even rare genetic disorders leave traces detectable through modern science. Environmental toxins don't skip generations. Behavioral patterns don't create spotless death scenes. Coincidence doesn't explain the presence of the pendant, an object that should have been locked away, with every victim. Her colleagues asked if she believed in curses. She didn't answer immediately, her usual rational confidence shaken. I believe, she finally said, that something is happening here that statistics cannot yet explain. Meanwhile, investigators re-examining Daniel's death were struck by eerie similarities: no marks, no toxins, no disruption in the environment. The chair wasn't even pushed back. It looked as though Daniel simply stopped living mid-thought. The pen in his hand hadn't fallen. His notebook held half a sentence. The abruptness felt surgical, almost intentional. And there was something else. Security footage revealed Daniel entering the study lab alone. No one else came in. No one left. Yet the pendant was not visible on him when he entered. It appeared only after he died, placed delicately in his hand as though by an unseen visitor. When the footage was shown to Mara, she refused to watch it a second time. Someone did this, she whispered. Someone is doing this to us. Her voice cracked under the weight of a truth no one wanted to say aloud. Detectives, pressured now by national attention, searched deeper into the family's past. They uncovered old letters, journals, and fragmented records hinting at generational trauma, unresolved conflicts, and secrets buried before modern documentation. But nothing explained why death targeted only one person per generation, or why that person always encountered the pendant before the end. As investigators built their timeline, they noticed a chilling pattern: each victim died at the exact same age. Rowan at 31. Adrian at 28, just 3 months shy of 31, though his doctor later revealed stress-related aging that made his heart resemble that of an older man. Daniel, exactly 31. 3 victims. 3 generations. Same pattern. Same ending. The discovery fueled speculation: was it a hereditary disorder manifesting at a particular age? Was it psychological pressure causing an unknown physiological response? Was it a calculated human intervention disguised behind a myth? Detectives debated fiercely. Some argued science simply hadn't caught up to the truth. Others believed someone was orchestrating these deaths with frightening precision. But Mara, haunted by her mother's whispers and her own memories of the pendant appearing in impossible places, felt differently. It doesn't matter if you call it a curse, Mara said during an interview. What matters is that something is killing us, and it knows exactly when to strike. The investigation reached a turning point when an old officer, long retired, almost forgotten, came forward with a notebook from decades earlier. Inside were notes dating back to Adrian's death. The handwritten line that chilled investigators read, "If this happens again, the pattern is deliberate. No accident repeats itself 3 times." Now the 3rd time had arrived. And with it, an undeniable sense that someone, or something, had been following the Wintons across decades. Reporters began using the phrase, 4th generation death countdown, and Mara found herself living in fear of the next number, 4. She had one surviving child, Elara, a sweet and compassionate girl who had always felt the weight of family history but never understood its magnitude. Mara knew she had to tell her. She knew she had to warn her. But the words came too late. Because far away, in a quiet house lit by soft lamps and filled with the scent of old wood, Elara Winton had already begun to feel watched. And the curse, real or not, was preparing to repeat itself once more. Long before outsiders labeled the Winton story as a curse, the family themselves carried unspoken knowledge, quiet fears, inherited warnings, and patterns of behavior passed down like coded messages. Each generation tried to bury the memories that haunted them, yet somehow those memories survived, threaded through diaries, hidden letters, and whispered conversations behind closed doors. And in the center of every secret, like a recurring shadow, lay the silver pendant, an object that once symbolized family heritage but had gradually become the emblem of their terror. For Mara, uncovering her family's past after Daniel's death became an obsession. She felt a responsibility not only as a grieving mother, but as the last surviving member old enough to remember the stories her own mother tried desperately to hide. She returned to the old Winton house, a place she had avoided for decades, and unlocked the drawers her mother once kept sealed. What she found there changed everything she thought she knew about the family's tragedies. The first discovery was Lillian's diary, its pages yellowed and fragile, but filled with a fear so vivid it seemed to reach out from the ink. Lillian had not simply mourned Rowan and Adrian, she had lived in constant dread of something repeating. She described hearing whispers in empty rooms, seeing the pendant move from place to place, and feeling a presence standing behind her late at night. But the most disturbing entries were those where she wrote about Rowan's past, stories he had never shared publicly. Rowan, as it turned out, had not been a man without enemies. Before settling down and starting a family, he had been involved in a bitter dispute with a former business partner, a man named Elias Dorn. Their conflict had escalated to threats, sabotage, and even a violent altercation that nearly cost Rowan his livelihood. The argument ended abruptly when Elias vanished, leaving behind only rumors. Some said he fled town to escape legal repercussions. Others believed something darker happened to him. Lillian's diary hinted at Rowan's guilt, though she never stated explicitly why. She only wrote of her fear that vengeance clings to blood, not memory. The pendant had belonged to Elias. According to Lillian, Rowan found it on his workshop doorstep 2 weeks before he died. The revelation reframed everything. If the pendant truly came from Rowan's old rival, then its presence at each death scene was no coincidence. It was a message, a reminder, or perhaps something far more sinister, a symbol of revenge carried through generations. Mara continued digging. She found letters written by Adrian that were never mailed, letters describing nightmares of a man standing at the foot of his bed, holding the pendant and whispering his name. Adrian had tried to rationalize the dreams but admitted that the pendant seemed to hum or vibrate slightly when he touched it, though no one else felt such a thing. Mara's breath tightened as she read those lines. She remembered Adrian, even as a child, waking up terrified and claiming to see someone standing in corners where no one existed. The psychological weight of these experiences became clearer when Mara found a set of medical records detailing Adrian's visits to local doctors. He complained of anxiety, hallucinations, and a sense of being followed. The doctors attributed it to trauma from losing his father so young. No one thought to connect his symptoms to the strange entries in Rowan's own journals, where he wrote of shadows he couldn't explain, strange knocks on the door at night, and the overwhelming sense that someone wanted him dead. The deeper Mara went, the more she realized that every generation had lived with the same fear, even if they never said it aloud. Rowan believed he was being watched. Adrian believed he was being hunted. Daniel believed something was coming for him. And each of them died with the pendant near their bodies, sometimes in their hands, other times placed so gently it felt ritualistic. But secrets within the Winton family weren't limited to journals and heirlooms. There were spoken stories too, passed down in incomplete fragments. Mara remembered one vividly. Her grandmother once told her that the Winton family was bound to something, though she never clarified what. Another time, she overheard Rowan's brother arguing with him, shouting that, "You can't outrun what you owe." When she asked her mother what that meant, Lillian insisted it was old family nonsense. But now, revisiting those memories, Mara understood that the adults had been terrified, not of a curse, but of a history no one wanted to confront. The turning point in Mara's investigation came when she found a locked wooden box beneath the floorboards. It contained photographs, correspondence between Rowan and Elias, and a torn contract that revealed their conflict revolved around more than money. Elias believed Rowan had stolen something from him, something he considered priceless. The final letter from Elias to Rowan, dated 1 month before Rowan's death, read, "You took my legacy. I will take yours." The tone was unmistakable. This was not a man planning to move on. This was a man planning revenge. As Mara stared at the letter, she felt a cold realization: what if the pendant wasn't cursed at all? What if it was simply a tool, a marker left by someone who understood the Winton family intimately? Someone who wanted each generation to suffer the same fate as Rowan? Someone who possibly passed their hatred down to their own descendants? But before she could fully process the implications, she noticed something that froze her breath. In the box, beneath the photos and letters, lay a faded blueprint. Not a blueprint of a building or workshop, this was a blueprint of the Winton family itself, with names, dates of birth, and ages written beside each one. Some names had lines crossing them out. Rowan's name. Adrian's name. Daniel's name. And beside Mara's daughter Ilara's name, written in a faint, shaking hand, were 2 numbers, 26 to 31. Mara dropped the paper as panic surged through her chest. Ilara was already 26. The secrets she had uncovered weren't just relics of the past, they were warnings. Warnings the family had failed to understand, warnings that pointed to a vengeance still active, still watching, still waiting. Every generation had been targeted. Every death had followed the same chilling pattern. And now the pattern was circling back to Ilara, the 4th generation. A horrifying truth settled into Mara's mind: this wasn't just a legacy built on fear. It was a legacy designed to ensure that fear never ended. Detective Aaron Hale had always believed that every mystery had a human explanation. Patterns, motives, psychology, these were his tools, sharper and more trustworthy than superstition. Yet from the moment he stepped into Ilara Winton's quiet bedroom on the night of her death, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just the eerie stillness or the pendant resting within reach of her outstretched fingers. It was the unmistakable feeling that the tragedy he was witnessing did not start with Ilara. It began long ago, carried silently through generations like an invisible predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The Winton case gnawed at Hale's mind. While other detectives filed their reports and moved on, he found himself returning to the crime scene in his thoughts, replaying every detail, searching for the piece that didn't belong. He reviewed photographs late at night, staring so long that the images seemed to morph, as though the answers were just beneath the surface. His colleagues noticed his obsession, warning him gently to step back before it consumed him. But Hale couldn't stop. Something about this case demanded understanding, demanded truth. What bothered him most was the pendant. The ornate silver piece was unlike anything he had seen in modern households, its design old, almost ceremonial. He held it briefly at the scene, and even though he told no one, the cold that shot through his arm felt unnatural, as if the metal carried memory. It wasn't fear that gripped him, but a strange sense of recognition, as if the pendant had witnessed the deaths and silently waited for him to look deeper. When Hale requested access to archival records about the family, his supervisor raised an eyebrow. "This isn't an active investigation anymore," he cautioned. "We don't have the resources to chase ghosts. Close the file." But Hale didn't close it. Instead, he visited the archives during off hours, logging in under an unrelated case ID. He scoured decades of reports, medical documents, and letters referenced in earlier notes. A pattern emerged, one that mirrored what Mara had recently uncovered on her own. The deaths were too uniform. Too perfectly spaced. Too clean. It was like someone had practiced the method, refining it across generations. A curse might frighten townsfolk, a human hand terrified Hale far more. He pored over Rowan's medical files, Adrian's autopsy photos, Daniel's toxicology reports. All inconclusive. All eerily similar. And always, the pendant. One night, while flipping through a dusty binder from the 1960s, he found something scribbled in the margins of an officer's report on Adrian's death: investigate family connections to Dorn. Suspicious history. The name Dorn appeared again in a separate note, half buried under faded ink. Hale circled it. The next morning, he dug deeper, tracing the name through town archives. Elias Dorn. Business disputes. Alleged threats. A disappearance no one fully investigated. His gut tightened. If this wasn't a curse, it was a vendetta. Hale's curiosity crossed into obsession when he tracked down the last living relative of Elias Dorn, a frail man named Frederick Dorn, residing in a care home 2 towns over. Hale visited him unofficially, flashing no badge. The elderly man's eyes widened the moment Hale placed a photo of the pendant on the table. "You shouldn't be here," the man rasped, voice trembling. "That thing, it was meant to settle a debt." "What debt?" Hale pressed. Frederick shook his head violently. "Not mine. Not yours. It's old, older than you can imagine. My family should have stayed out of it. Elias never let go of anything. He said he'd make the Wintons feel what he felt." "What did he feel?" "Loss," Frederick whispered. "Humiliation. Betrayal." He paused. "Elias believed Rowan stole something from him. Something that was meant to be passed down our line. When he vanished, our family assumed he left town. But my grandfather used to swear he saw him one night, standing at the Winton doorstep, holding the pendant." The old man suddenly grew quiet, staring at Hale with pale, watery eyes. "He said curses don't kill people. People kill people. But sometimes they hide behind curses to make it easier." On his drive back, Hale felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. Someone had started this cycle deliberately. Someone had taught their descendants to finish what Elias Dorn began. And if the vendetta lived through families the way the Wintons suffered through generations of trauma, then vengeance had merely evolved over time, passing like a dark inheritance. But his most disturbing discovery came not from archives or interviews, it came from an envelope left anonymously on his desk late one evening. No name. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. When Hale examined it, his heart stopped. The photo showed the 4 Winton victims: Rowan, Adrian, Daniel, and Alara. But the impossibility wasn't the grouping, it was the date stamped faintly on the bottom corner. The photo was dated 30 years before Daniel or Alara were even born. Hale's pulse raced. It couldn't be real. Yet it looked genuine, aged naturally, edges worn. He scanned it under magnification, studying shadows, angles, backgrounds. No digital tampering. This was an old photograph. Someone had collected the Winton victims long before 2 of them existed. Someone had planned the pattern. He brought the photo to his superior. Instead of being impressed, the man grew furious. Where did you get this? Who authorized you to pursue this? I told you to close the file. When Hale argued that the evidence pointed to a long-term orchestrated crime, the response was chilling. Walk away, Hale. Some cases aren't meant to be solved. It was not a warning. It was an order. That night, Hale sat in his car outside the station, gripping the photo tightly. It wasn't just the resistance from the department, it was the realization that someone within the system knew more than they were saying. Someone knew the truth had been buried intentionally. And that meant one thing: Elara's death wasn't the end. It was the continuation of something sinister. Hale made a decision then, a decision that broke every rule he had ever followed. He would investigate off the books, with no badge, no backup, and no official protection. He would uncover the truth the department refused to acknowledge. He started by retracing Daniel's final days, interviewing friends who revealed details previously overlooked. Daniel had complained of being followed by a figure wearing a long coat. He had mentioned receiving strange letters with no sender, each containing nothing but a drawing of the pendant. One friend admitted Daniel had tried to destroy the pendant by smashing it with a hammer, only to find it completely unscathed. As Hale connected these accounts with the historical patterns, his vision of the case sharpened. This wasn't supernatural. It was strategic. Calculated. A generational vendetta executed with patience bordering on obsession. But the real shock came when Hale found footprints near Elara's home, small, precise prints left in soft soil behind the house. They belonged to someone who had been watching her from the tree line for weeks. And the prints didn't match any Winton family member. They didn't match any police boots. They matched an unknown shoe model, rare, custom, and nearly impossible to trace. Someone had walked the perimeter of the Winton home repeatedly. Someone determined. Someone patient. Someone who wanted the curse to continue. The final straw came when Hale discovered a note inside his own mailbox: "You're getting too close. Stop before you become part of the pattern." The handwriting matched the envelope that held the impossible photograph. Hale stared at the message, cold dread filling his lungs. But beneath the fear, something else ignited: resolve. He wasn't going to stop. Because if the pattern continued, there was someone else on the list. Someone not yet dead. Someone who didn't even know they were already being hunted. And Hale intended to find them before the curse did. Elara Winton had grown up hearing the family tragedy spoken about in careful fragments, as though every word carried the power to wake something sleeping. No one told her directly that her father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had died in the same chilling, unexplained way. Instead, she pieced the story together from half-finished sentences, the tightness in her mother's voice whenever the past came up, and the way relatives lowered their tone whenever they mentioned the Winton name. Children overhear more than adults realize, and Elara had learned early that silence often hides the loudest truths. From childhood, Elara carried a quiet sensitivity that made her different. She wasn't fearful or timid, far from it, but she had a heightened awareness of others' emotions, as though she could sense the tension in a room before anyone spoke. She noticed when lights flickered strangely, or when footsteps sounded muffled in the hallway at night. Most children outgrow such instincts, Elara never did. They followed her into adulthood, shadows she learned to accept rather than explain. By the time she reached her mid-twenties, Elara had crafted a life that looked peaceful on the surface. She worked as a freelance illustrator, creating soft, dreamlike artwork that contrasted sharply with the unease she felt in her own life. Her home was filled with drawings, plants, and warm lighting, an environment she curated intentionally, as though she believed comfort could ward off the invisible heaviness she sometimes felt pressing against the walls. But even in that comforting world, something was wrong. Her mother, Mara, rarely visited without scanning the windows first. She asked strange questions: whether Elara felt tired recently, whether she had heard any knocks at night, whether she ever found objects out of place. Elara tried to laugh these off as maternal paranoia, but each question planted a seed of doubt. Mara's fear was too specific. Too familiar. Too rehearsed. And then there were Ilara's dreams. For months, she dreamt of a man standing in a doorway, his face blurred, his silhouette unnervingly still. He said nothing. He simply watched. Sometimes she woke with her heart violently racing. Sometimes she found her blankets folded back neatly, as though someone had pulled them away while she slept. She told herself it was stress, an overactive imagination, the subconscious mind replaying her mother's anxiety. But the dreams intensified. She began waking at 3:11 a.m., the same minute each time. Her bedroom clock always blinked the same numbers, as if frozen. She replaced the clock, the new one did the same. Once, she walked into her living room to find a sketch she didn't remember drawing, a rough, shaky depiction of the pendant she had seen only once in a photograph. She stared at the drawing for long minutes, unable to explain why her hand had captured details she had never studied. Her friends noticed the changes before she did. She became quieter. Distracted. She checked over her shoulder more often. During conversations, her attention drifted to some invisible point behind the speaker, as though she sensed something standing nearby. When they teased her about being haunted, she forced a smile, but something in her eyes flickered with truth. As the strange experiences increased, so did Mara's desperation to protect her daughter. She finally revealed the full story, the family deaths, the pendant, the eerie patterns that repeated like clockwork. She told Ilara that every Winton victim had been around the same age and had shown the same signs weeks before their deaths: disturbed sleep, strange noises, visions or dreams of someone watching them, and the sudden appearance of the pendant. Ilara listened in stunned silence. The pieces of her life rearranged themselves into a horrifying mosaic. Yet she didn't panic. She didn't scream or deny it. Instead, she said softly, "I always felt something was waiting for me." Those words shattered Mara. After that conversation, Mara moved into Ilara's home temporarily. She slept on the couch, insisting that being close might break the pattern. She went through the house each night, checking locks, shutting curtains, whispering reassurances that felt like half-prayers. Hale, now secretly investigating the case, visited often under the pretense of collecting background information. In truth, he was watching Ilara closely, hunting for any clue that could prevent her from becoming the fourth casualty. Ilara, trying to remain calm, began documenting her dreams, her waking sensations, and the strange occurrences around her. One entry described hearing someone breathing behind her when she washed dishes, soft, steady, human. She spun around, but no one was there. Another time, she found muddy footprints just inside the back door despite living alone. She checked her shoes, they were clean. She checked the locks, they were intact. She cleaned the prints, but they returned 2 days later, slightly shifted, as though whoever left them was returning. Hale took plaster impressions of the prints, growing colder as he realized they matched the same shoe pattern he found outside the previous Winton homes. The same person, or the same type of person, had been circling the family for decades. But the turning point came one night when Ilara, her voice trembling, called Hale directly. "I need you to hear something," she said. He rushed over, and she led him to her bedroom. She handed him her phone and pressed play on her latest voice memo, a recording she had made accidentally. She had been journaling verbally when the audio suddenly captured a second voice. It was faint, dry, almost breathless, but unmistakably human. It whispered her name. Then paused. Then inhaled sharply, as though leaning close to the microphone. Hale played it again. And again. Each time the whisper grew more chilling. "That's not a dream," Hale said finally. "Someone was in the room with you." The color drained from Mara's face. Ilara merely nodded, as though she already knew. From that night forward, the house was no longer a sanctuary. Every sound, floorboards shifting, windows rattling, the hum of the refrigerator, felt like a presence drawing nearer. Hale installed temporary security devices, but none detected forced entry. None recorded movement. None explained why Alara woke with small bruises on her wrists or why she found the pendant drawn repeatedly in her sketchbook despite not remembering drawing it. Whatever was happening wasn't random. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't imagined. It was controlled. One evening, Mara awoke from the couch to hear Alara talking softly in her room. She assumed Alara was on the phone, but when she approached the door, her blood ran cold. Alara was alone, yet her voice trembled as she asked, "Who are you? What do you want?" Silence followed. Then the unmistakable sound of a second breath responding. Mara burst in, but the room was empty except for Alara, shaking violently. "It's getting closer," Alara whispered. Hale, now fully invested, realized Alara wasn't just another name on a list. She was the final key to understanding the Winton mystery. But he also sensed something more terrifying: whoever, or whatever, had orchestrated the first 3 deaths was now actively stalking Alara, accelerating the timeline. Her window began appearing open despite being locked. Her drawings began depicting a man with an obscured face, always standing just behind her. And the pendant, missing for years, finally appeared on her pillow one morning, as though placed gently beside her while she slept. The fear inside the home became almost suffocating. Yet beneath that fear, Alara carried a strange resilience. Instead of collapsing under the weight of her family's history, she confronted it. She demanded answers. She challenged Hale to consider possibilities he avoided. She insisted on tracing her lineage, searching for motives, studying Elias Dorn's legacy with a determination that mirrored the obsessive vengeance unfolding around her. But there was one thing she couldn't escape: her birthday, her 31st, was approaching. The same age the others had died. The same age written beside her name in the blueprint Mara found. As the date approached, Hale felt the tension inside the house become a living entity. The nights grew colder. The dreams intensified. The footsteps outside became louder, closer. And the whisper in the audio memo replayed in his mind endlessly, as if warning him he was too late. Alara tried to stay strong, but even she admitted one night, with tears burning her eyes, "I don't think I'm meant to survive this." Hale refused to accept that. He vowed to break the pattern, to expose the truth, to stop the perpetrator who had stalked the Winton family for 4 generations. But as he dug deeper, he confronted a terrifying realization: someone had been preparing Alara's death years before she was born. And the final stage of the plan had already begun. Detective Hale had always trusted linear timelines. Events happened, records followed, and patterns formed based on facts anchored in time. But the Winton case was the first to break that structure completely. Every clue he uncovered, every discovery Alara made, seemed to rewrite the family's past rather than explain it. The deeper Hale went, the more he realized this wasn't a pattern being formed, it was a pattern being maintained, crafted carefully across generations like an elaborate ritual. And Alara was positioned to be its next fulfillment. The investigation reached a turning point when Hale received a parcel from a retired archivist who had heard of his off-the-books search. Inside the parcel was a stack of documents so old the edges crumbled like dried leaves, and among them was a fragile envelope stamped with a date that made Hale's breath stop: 1929. He opened it gingerly, revealing a series of letters exchanged between Elias Dorn and an unnamed accomplice. The content was fragmented, but one phrase repeated with eerie consistency: "He will lose what I lost. And his name will echo the cost." The letter referenced Rowan Winton by name, years before Rowan ever married or had children. The implication was impossible unless the feud had been deeper, personal, and born long before the documented dispute over business. Hale pored over the letters until something in the final one made him sit upright. Elias wrote of securing the symbol, a reference that Hale immediately connected to the pendant. He described it not as an heirloom but as a legacy marker, something tied to the debt Rowan owed him. But what debt? Hale knew the financial dispute couldn't explain this level of obsession. What shook him further was a sketched diagram at the bottom of one letter: a circle divided into 4 sections, each labeled with a generation number. 3 sections were shaded. The 4th was blank. The blueprint Mara found in her own home now made horrifying sense. Someone had been calculating the deaths, preparing them, marking time. And if Elias Dorn was the architect, then someone had inherited his mission. Hale brought the documents to Elara and Mara. Elara studied the sketch with a quiet dread. "It's like he planned the deaths before the family even existed," she whispered. "How can someone hate us before we were born?" Mara's hands trembled violently. "This means someone else knew the plan. Someone who kept it alive." The atmosphere inside the house thickened. The shadows seemed to grow stronger, darker, as if reacting to the truth being uncovered. Even the lights flickered slightly, though Hale told himself it was just faulty wiring, even if the rational explanation felt thinner each day. Still searching for tangible evidence, Hale reached out to a forensic analyst he trusted outside the department. He brought him sealed evidence from all 4 Winton scenes, fibers, trace debris, and minute samples collected from surfaces around the bodies. After weeks of silence, the analyst called Hale with a shaken voice. "These scenes are staged," he said. "Perfectly staged. Too perfect." "How do you mean?" Hale pressed. "There's no secondary disturbance. No sign of another person. It's as if someone cleaned the scene, but not physically. More like they prepared the environment beforehand, predicted exactly how the victim would fall, where the pendant would be placed, and how nothing else would be touched." "Predicted?" Hale repeated, the idea unsettling. "Yes. Like they rehearsed it." The word rehearsed stuck with Hale like a splinter in his mind. It wasn't enough evidence to prove human involvement, but it intensified the theory he couldn't shake. Someone had been perfecting these deaths over decades, learning from each one. It wasn't supernatural, it was practiced. Controlled. Designed. Everything escalated when Hale requested access to National Archival storage for missing persons from the early 1900s. Among thousands of deteriorating files, he found one that chilled him, a missing person report for Elias Dorn. But the description didn't match Elias physically, it matched a man Rowan once described in his own journal. A man who had followed him for weeks. A man whose features were forgettably ordinary, like someone meant to disappear into a crowd. What stood out was this line, "Last seen with an unidentified young boy approximately 10 years old. A second generation. A successor." The report didn't confirm the boy's identity, but one chilling possibility emerged. Elias had groomed someone, perhaps a son, perhaps a protege, to continue what he started. If so, that person would have passed the mission to their own descendants. Which meant the Wintons weren't being haunted, they were being hunted by a legacy of revenge. Hale's search took him even deeper into obscure public records, land transfers, and census reports. He traced property owned by the Dorn family and stumbled across a record for a small cabin deep in the woods, purchased decades ago and maintained by a descendant whose name had been changed multiple times. This wasn't normal behavior for an average citizen, it was a survival tactic, the strategy of someone who wanted to erase their trail. Driven by intuition more than evidence, Hale drove to the location the next morning. The cabin was decrepit, seemingly abandoned, but the land surrounding it showed signs of recent movement, tire marks, disturbed soil, and footprints similar to the ones near Elara's home. Inside, dust coated every surface except one, the small table in the cabin's center. On it lay faded photographs of the Winton family across generations, newspaper clippings, scribbled notes outlining timelines, and at the center, an empty space where a missing photo once rested. A space exactly the size of the impossible photograph sent to Hale. His pulse hammered as he realized what this meant. Whoever had been following the Wintons had come here recently, perhaps even lived here. Perhaps still did. As he lifted one of the notes, a creak sounded behind him. He spun, gun raised, but the doorway was empty. Still, he wasn't alone. He felt it. He left quickly, taking as much evidence as he dared without disturbing the scene too obviously. He knew the department would never believe him, and worse, they might be involved in covering it up. His only allies were Mara and Elara, whose fear had transformed into a need for truth. Meanwhile, Elara began experiencing strange episodes at home. Sometimes she woke with her sketches rearranged into a circle. Other times she discovered crumbs of soil on her carpet. Once, she found a pendant outside her bedroom door. Hale intensified monitoring around the house, but still no person appeared on any camera. The intruder was precise, cautious, and practiced. The revelation that broke the timeline open completely came from an old genealogist Hale consulted about the Dorn family. After reviewing Elias Dorn's lineage and cross-referencing unexplained disappearances across decades, she gave Hale a horrifying conclusion. "You're not dealing with one accomplice," she said in a low voice. "You're dealing with a lineage that passed down an unfinished vow." They didn't want closure. They wanted continuation. A generation avenging a generation. A pattern avenging a pattern. When Hale returned to Elara's house that night with this new information, he found Mara pale and trembling. She held a small wooden box, the same one that had once contained the pendant. Inside the box, she found something hidden beneath a false panel, a faded photograph of Elias Dorn standing beside a young boy. But the boy's face was circled in ink. Below it, written in Rowan's trembling handwriting, were the words, "He won't stop. Not even after I'm gone." Hale stared at the photograph, ice running through his veins. The boy was the same figure from the impossible photograph he received. The same blurred shape appearing behind Daniel in old sketches. The same silhouette Elara described in her dreams. And he was still alive. Somewhere out there, the next Dorn descendant, the one who inherited the vendetta, was waiting for Elara's 31st birthday. Someone had been planning her death before she even existed. The past wasn't repeating. The past was working ahead of schedule. The more Hale dug, the clearer it became that the Winton tragedy was not a curse born from superstition but a revenge meticulously engineered across generations. The documents, the cabin, the hidden blueprints, they all pointed toward a single, horrifying truth: someone had kept Elias Dorn's hatred alive long after his disappearance. Someone had shaped their entire lineage around the mission of destroying the Wintons, one generation at a time. But the final shock came when Hale uncovered what the Wintons themselves had been hiding. Mara, trembling with exhaustion, revealed a truth she had kept buried for decades. After Adrian's death, her mother, Lillian, had confided something she never wrote in her diary. Something she believed would break Mara if she ever heard it. Lillian had once seen Rowan arguing violently with Elias Dorn behind the workshop just days before Rowan died. She saw Rowan shove Elias, and she saw Elias fall, but Rowan swore her to silence, insisting it was an accident. He begged her never to speak of it again. And Lillian, terrified and loyal, obeyed. But that wasn't the darkest part. Lillian told Mara that after Elias vanished, Rowan received letters from an unknown sender, letters he burned immediately. She remembered the fear in Rowan's eyes, the sleepless nights, the sudden decision to lock the pendant away. He knew. Somehow, he knew Elias hadn't truly disappeared. He knew someone, Elias or another, had chosen to turn the past into a long, punishing retaliation. Yet Rowan never shared the full truth. He died before he could. Mara had lived most of her life believing her parents were hiding something to protect her from grief. Now she realized they were protecting her from guilt. Because if Rowan truly caused Elias's fall, accidental or otherwise, then perhaps every death afterward had been retribution, not random tragedy. The Winton family had been punished for Rowan's secret, a debt paid not by the guilty but by generations who never knew the crime existed. Hale struggled to accept the magnitude of this revelation. It wasn't just the Dorn family's revenge, it was the Wintons' silence that had allowed it to persist. If Rowan had faced justice, if the truth had been recorded, Elias's descendants might never have turned vengeance into a legacy. Guilt and secrecy had created the perfect soil for obsession. And in that soil, someone had cultivated a vendetta so deeply rooted that it outlived both families' original participants. But one question still haunted Hale: who carried the vendetta forward? The answer came in the form of an old case file Hale found misfiled in the local records. It referenced a man named Lucas Dorn, born in the 1930s, who had been investigated for stalking a local family in the 1960s. The family was never named in the report, but the geographical details matched the Winton neighborhood. The case was closed abruptly without explanation. Hale's stomach twisted as he read the notes. Lucas fit the description of the boy seen with Elias in the missing persons report. And Lucas had a son of his own. A son whose name had been sealed due to a juvenile offense, only to vanish from public records after turning 18. A lineage disappearing on purpose. A target chosen before birth. A mission handed down like inheritance. As Hale pieced the timeline together, he realized something devastating: every time a Winton died, a Dorn was nearby. Not always present, but close enough to monitor, to manipulate, to prepare. The disappearances, the moves across towns, the hidden cabin, they were all part of a systematic shadowing of the Winton family tree. And the most chilling insight hit him then. Someone in the Winton family had known. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't intentional. But someone had known the truth, and kept it quiet out of fear. Rowan had known. Lillian had suspected. And in her own way, Mara had sensed it too. Their silence, their refusal to confront the past, had allowed the pattern to strengthen. Not because they wanted it, but because terror paralyzed them. Hale confronted Mara gently. "There's more," he said. "Something you haven't told me." Mara hesitated. Tears collected in her eyes. "Before Daniel died," she whispered, "he told me someone approached him at night outside his apartment. A man, with no expression. He said the man told him, 'It will end with your daughter.'" Hale froze. The plan was never just generational, it was prophetic. The Dorn line had chosen Alara long ago. Every step had been leading to her, every death a step closer to the final act. The truth was no longer about what happened. It was about what was coming. And Hale now understood fully, painfully, there was one more victim planned. One more name written in the shadows. Ilara's. Her death wasn't a possibility. It was the climax of a story written decades before she was born. Hale believed he finally understood the pattern: for generations, for deaths, one final target. But the case took a shocking turn when he uncovered a sealed police file marked Victim 5, Survived. The file was thin, as if someone had deliberately removed most of the contents, but one detail stood out: a young Winton relative, born between Mara and Daniel's generation, had gone missing at age 31 and reappeared months later under a new identity. The report described the survivor as deeply traumatized, paranoid, convinced a man was hunting him. The police labeled him unstable and quietly closed the case. Hale tracked him down, an older man now living off the grid. When they met, the survivor stared at Hale with hollow eyes and whispered, "You're too late. They don't stop. They never stop. I saw the list. I saw her name." "Ilara?" Hale asked. The man nodded slowly. "She's the end of it. The final piece. They've been waiting for her." His voice cracked as he added, "And the one leading them, he's someone you've already spoken to." Hale felt the ground shift beneath him. The curse wasn't supernatural. It was organized. And the final strike was already in motion.